Don't leave my fiancée out here. She's the one who matters. My husband's voice cracked through the smoke, pouring across the parking garage, and the hand he should have used to pull me from under the collapsed beam was instead wrapped around another woman's shoulders, guiding her toward the open-air vent. Pinned beneath 300 pounds of concrete and rebar, my 6-year-old daughter pressed against my chest, her fever-hot cheek burning through my coat. I watched the man I'd married pick someone else. The parking structure under Eaton Center had come down in sections, like a deck of cards folding in on itself, the moment the gas line beneath it ignited. I didn't know that yet. All I knew was the dark, and the dust, and Quinn's small body shaking against mine, her breath rattling with the chest cold she'd had for 3 days. The one I'd begged Desmond no. The one I'd begged my husband to let me take her to urgent care for that morning, before he insisted we all go together to his work gala instead. Because optics mattered, because the partners needed to see the family man. I should have known the moment he introduced his colleague Brielle at the door, his hand resting too easily at the small of her back, that the optics he cared about weren't about family at all. "Mommy, it's hot," Quinn whispered, and I felt the heat radiating off her worse than before, worse than it had been an hour ago when the building was still standing, and I was holding a glass of cheap Prosecco in a ballroom 3 floors above where I now lay buried. "I know, baby. Help is coming." I didn't know that either. I just needed her to believe it because the alternative was watching her go quiet in my arms while I bled from a slab of concrete that had caught my hip. When the ceiling gave way, my scarf wound tight around the gash to slow it. My voice nearly gone from screaming for the first 20 minutes before I understood no one was coming for the sound of my voice. They were coming for his. I heard him out there, past the wall of rubble, past the flickering emergency lights, telling the rescue captain that his fiancée had a heart condition. Fiancée. 5 years married, and I learned the word from a stranger's mouth through 8 inches of broken concrete. "Sir, we have confirmed casualties on this level. We need everyone to stay back. She's not a casualty, she's my responsibility. Get her out first. I'll pay whatever it costs. I'll have my lawyer file injunctions against this entire company if..." That was the first time in our marriage I heard Desmond threaten someone with lawyers on someone else's behalf. He'd never once threatened anyone for me. "I want to tell you." I assumed his name. I didn't. My throat had given out an hour before, and some small, cold part of me, the part that would carry me through everything that came after, decided that if he wasn't going to come looking for the sound of me, I wasn't going to waste what little voice I had left begging for him to. So I turned my focus to Quinn, to the small space of air pocket we had, to keeping her talking, keeping her awake, because somewhere in a half-remembered first aid course I'd taken when she was a baby, I knew you weren't supposed to let a feverish child sleep too deep when you couldn't be sure what was wrong. "Tell me about your class trip," I rasped. "The one you have next month. Tell me everything you're going to see at the aquarium." She mumbled something about beluga whales, about how her teacher said they could hear each other from miles and miles away, and I held on to that small, ordinary fact like a rope, because it was the only thing in that dark, collapsed garage that still made sense. It was 40 minutes later. 40 minutes of listening to Brielle's pretty, wounded sobs about her twisted ankle. 40 minutes of Desmond's voice softening every time he spoke to her and hardening every time someone mentioned the woman and child still trapped beneath the lower level. That I heard a new voice. Calm. Clipped. Used to being obeyed. "Where is my daughter?" It wasn't a question. My father didn't ask questions when something belonged to him, and someone else was standing between him and it. I hadn't spoken to Garrison Calloway in 4 years. Not since the night I stood in the foyer of his house in Rosedale and told him I was marrying Desmond Whitfield whether he approved or not. That I didn't need his company, his money, or his permission, that for once in my life I was going to choose love over leverage. He'd looked at me the way he looked at a bad quarterly report and said, "If you walk out that door for that man, don't bother walking back through this one." I walked out. I meant it. I assumed he did too. But somewhere between the gala registry that listed my married name and a phone call from a city councilor who owed him a favor, Garrison Calloway had found out his daughter and granddaughter were buried under a collapsed parking structure on the worst night of the year to be buried under anything. And he had gotten on a chartered helicopter from Calgary so fast that the pilot later told me he hadn't even finished his coffee. I heard the rescue team's tone change instantly, not because they suddenly cared more about a trapped mother and child. Rescue workers, I'd learn later, almost never abandon confirmed casualties for the comfort of the uninjured, no matter what Desmond had been telling them. But because the man directing them now controlled half the cranes and engineering contracts in the downtown core, and he had just informed the fire chief, with terrifying calm, that every resource on this site belonged to getting his family out, immediately, or there would be no site left for anyone to direct come Monday morning. Olivia. His voice came through the gap above us, and for the first time in years I heard something in it that wasn't disappointment. Olivia, can you hear me? Dad. The word felt foreign in my torn throat. Quinn's fever's bad. My hip, there's a beam. Stay still. We're coming through the east gap, it's load-bearing safe. Talk to me. Keep talking, so I did. I talked about nothing, about the beluga whales, about how cold the concrete was, while above us I heard hydraulic jacks groaning, and Desmond's voice rising in confusion as the rescue crew that had been carrying Brielle toward the ambulance suddenly redirected. Half of them, toward the eastern collapse, toward me. What are you doing? She's fine. My wife is fine. She's not even badly hurt. Get back over here. Sir, step back. This is Mr. Calloway's site authorization now. We need you clear of the equipment. Calloway? What the hell does Olivia's father have to do with? I will admit, lying there with my daughter slipping in and out against my chest, I felt something close to satisfaction at the confusion in his voice. He had spent 5 years calling my father a controlling tyrant, had forbidden me from taking his calls, had told me repeatedly that the Calloway name was a cage, and he was setting me free from it. He had never once asked what it might mean, in a moment like this one, to have it back. They pulled the beam off in pieces, slow, careful. My father's voice a steady drumbeat the entire time, narrating every movement so I wouldn't panic the way he used to talk me through tightening a bike chain or a bad trade when I was 17 and thought I knew everything. When the light finally broke through, white and harsh and beautiful, I saw his face for the first time in 4 years, older than I remembered, lines carved deep around eyes that were, for once, not unreadable at all. He was crying. I had never once seen my father cry. There's my girl, he said, and reached down into the rubble himself, past 2 paramedics, and pulled Quinn into his arms first, swaddling her in his own suit jacket, checking her breathing with the kind of practiced calm of a man who had once, decades ago, sat beside my mother's hospital bed and learned exactly how to keep fear out of his voice. They got the stretcher under me next, as they lifted me out into the open garage level, into air that didn't taste like dust and blood. I saw Desmond standing frozen by the ambulance bay, Brielle clinging to his arm, both of them staring at the small army of paramedics and engineers now swarming around me like I was something precious instead of something he'd left behind. Olivia. He said my name like he was trying to remember if he was allowed to. Olivia, thank God. I was so worried. I tried to get to you. They wouldn't let me through. I looked at him from the stretcher, my daughter already wrapped against my father's chest 10 feet away, breathing steady now, color coming back into her face, and I felt the strangest thing. Not rage. Not yet. Just a vast, quiet clarity, the kind you only get once or twice in a life, where every small lie of the last 5 years arranges itself into a single, undeniable shape. You told them I wasn't badly hurt, said. My voice barely carried. You told them to take her first. She has a heart condition, Liv. You know that. I told you about her arrhythmia. You've never mentioned her arrhythmia in your life. You've never mentioned her at all. I closed my eyes. Take me to the hospital. Don't follow me there. He followed anyway, of course. Stood in the hallway outside the surgical unit for 6 hours, while they put 14 stitches in my hip and ran scans on a fracture in my pelvis that the doctor said, with carefully neutral professionalism, was going to need months of physiotherapy and absolutely no walking on it unassisted for at least 3 weeks. He brought flowers the next morning, gas station carnations, already wilting, and a story about how Brielle was just a colleague going through a hard divorce, how he'd panicked, how the whole thing had looked so much worse than it was. I let him talk. I'd gotten very good over 5 years at letting Desmond talk. It was while he was midway through his third apology, the one where he started crying and reached for my hand, that the door opened and my father walked in without knocking, the way he'd always done in his own house, the way that used to make me furious and now just made me feel, for the first time in years, safe. Mr. Whitfield. Garrison's voice was pleasant. Pleasant in the way a closing door is pleasant right before it locks. I think it's time you and I had a conversation about the Whitfield family's construction contracts, the 3 that run through my subsidiaries, the ones I believe your father's firm has been quietly behind on for 14 months. Desmond went very still. I watched the color drain out of his face the way it had never once drained when I told him I was in pain. When I told him our daughter's fever wasn't going down. When I lay buried under a parking garage telling a 6-year-old about beluga whales because I thought it might be the last conversation we ever had. That has nothing to do with. It has everything to do with it. You married my daughter assuming I'd disowned her completely, that there was no leverage left in the Calloway name worth respecting. You assumed wrong, And you assumed it the same night you decided a woman with a twisted ankle mattered more than a wife with a torn hip and a feverish child. I find those two assumptions remarkably consistent with each other. My father set his briefcase on the foot of my bed, opened it, and withdrew a folder thick enough that I knew instantly he had not put it together in the 4 days since the garage collapsed. He had been keeping it for years, waiting, I would understand much later, for the day I finally needed it. "Olivia," Desmond said, turning to me, abandoning all pretense of fighting my father directly, the way he always had, going for the softer target. "Liv, please, don't let him do this. We can fix this. I love you. You told a rescue team to save your fiancé first," I said quietly. "I'm not your wife in any way that matters, Desmond. I haven't been for a long time. I just didn't want to admit how long." The divorce took 4 months, not because Desmond fought it. He didn't have the resources left to fight much of anything. Once my father's lawyers finished walking through 14 months of falsified contractor invoices that he'd been using to cover the money he'd been spending on Brielle's condo on the Danforth. But because Canadian family courts, even expedited ones, move at their own pace, and because I found somewhere in those 4 months that I wasn't in any hurry anymore. For the first time since I was 21 years old, nobody was waiting for me to make myself smaller, faster, more agreeable. I could simply heal. Brielle, for her part, discovered very quickly that a man under criminal investigation for fraud is not, in fact, a man capable of supporting a condo on the Danforth, and the engagement she'd been so loudly celebrating in hospital hallways across the city dissolved roughly 6 weeks before the divorce was finalized. I heard secondhand, through a cousin who still worked in Desmond's old firm, that she'd moved to Mississauga and was telling people the whole thing had been a misunderstanding, that she'd never known he was married. I didn't have it in me to correct the record. Let her have her version. I had mine. My mother-in-law, Patricia, who had spent 5 years telling me I was lucky to have married into a family like theirs. Lucky that Desmond had even looked twice at a girl whose father had disowned her. Called me exactly once after the trial, not to apologize but to ask, with breathtaking calm, whether I might consider speaking to my father about the contracts on her behalf, for old times' sake. I told her old times were exactly what I was trying to leave behind, and I didn't pick up when she called again. It was Quinn who pulled me out of the worst of it, the way children always do, simply by needing breakfast and bedtime stories and reassurance that the bad night under the parking garage was over and wasn't coming back. She recovered fully within 2 weeks, the fever nothing more sinister than a stubborn chest infection that, once treated properly, never left a mark. I wasn't so lucky. The hip ached on cold mornings for the better part of a year, a permanent souvenir of the night my husband chose someone else's comfort over my survival. And some mornings, walking Quinn to her new school near my father's house in Rosedale, I'd feel it twinge and think, not with bitterness anymore, but with something closer to gratitude. That pain was at least proof I'd lived through it. My father and I didn't fix 4 years of silence overnight. There were dinners that ended in old arguments resurfacing, nights I drove home from his house furious all over again, at the man who'd once made me choose between his approval and my own heart. But he showed up every single week for Quinn's recitals and her terrible, beautiful kindergarten art projects, and slowly, the way trust does when you let it, ours rebuilt itself, brick by careful brick, sturdier the second time for having been broken once. A year and a half after the collapse, I stood at a podium in a renovated wing of St. Michael's Hospital, the one my father had quietly funded, the one we'd named together, the Callaway Family Center for Women's Trauma Recovery, and looked out at a room full of reporters and donors and survivors, some of whom had lived through nights not unlike mine. Quinn sat in the front row in a dress she'd picked out herself, swinging her legs, occasionally waving at me like I was a celebrity instead of just her mother. 5 years ago, I told the room, I thought love meant making myself disappear a little more every day, so that someone else could take up the space I left behind. I learned, in the worst night of my life, lying under a collapsed parking garage in this city, that the people who truly love you don't ask you to disappear. They come looking for you. No matter what it costs them, no matter how long it's been, no matter how many doors you slammed on your way out. My father stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, doing his level best to look unmoved, failing completely. The way he'd failed every single time Quinn ran toward him these days, with her arms outstretched. I caught his eye across the crowd and saw him nod once, the smallest motion, the kind that used to mean nothing to me and now meant absolutely everything. That winter, walking home from the center in the kind of bitter Toronto cold that bites through even the best coat, Quinn's mittened hand in mine, I felt the old ache in my hip flare up against the wind, and instead of bracing against it the way I used to, I simply let myself feel it The way you let yourself feel anything that proves you survived it. Somewhere behind us, the city lights were coming on one by one, and ahead of us, my father's car was waiting at the curb, exactly where it had been waiting every week for the last year, without fail, without question, without ever once making me ask twice.